For decades, the world operated on a simple, powerful assumption: the United States and China were bound together by an unbreakable economic partnership. China would manufacture the world's goods, and America would consume them, creating a cycle of mutual prosperity that lifted hundreds of millions from poverty and kept prices low for Western households. This era of hyperglobalization, however, is now decisively over. We are not just witnessing a minor trade dispute or a temporary cooling of relations. We are in the early stages of a fundamental and irreversible economic decoupling, a strategic showdown that is not only likely but has become inevitable. This separation will not be a contest between equals. It is an asymmetric conflict where a structurally fragile China is far more vulnerable than most observers comprehend. The narrative of China's unstoppable rise has masked deep-seated weaknesses that are now being exposed. For years, the Communist Party of China built its legitimacy on a promise of ever-increasing prosperity. But the engine of that growth, a debt-fueled construction and property boom, has sputtered and died, leaving behind a mountain of hidden losses and a system teetering on the edge. The United States, in contrast, possesses a more resilient, decentralized, and innovative economy. Its challenges are real, but they are manageable. China's challenges, on the other hand, are existential. The coming breakup will rewrite the global order, and understanding the core imbalance between these two giants is the single most important geopolitical insight of our time. The process of untangling these two economies, which are the largest in the world, is a monumental task. It is estimated that the decoupling is only about 1/4 to 1/3 complete. Supply chains built over 30 years cannot be rerouted overnight. Capital that has been locked into long-term projects cannot be instantly repatriated. But the direction of travel is clear, and the pace is accelerating. Driven by national security concerns, technological competition, and a fundamental clash of values, Washington is methodically dismantling the ties that once bound the two nations. This is not a partisan issue. It is a bipartisan consensus in America that the previous era of engagement has failed. As this great unraveling unfolds, it becomes crucial to look past the headlines and examine the structural realities. The question is no longer if the US and China will decouple, but how this process will play out and who will bear the greater cost. The evidence overwhelmingly suggests that time is on America's side. While the US works to solve its primary vulnerability, a dependence on Chinese rare earth minerals, China's internal problems are compounding daily. Its demographic decline is accelerating, its debt crisis is deepening, and its political system is becoming more rigid and brittle. This is the story of a strategic showdown where one side can afford the divorce, while the other faces ruin. To understand why China is in such a perilous position, we must look beyond its gleaming skyscrapers and high-speed trains. Beneath the surface of its state-managed economy lie three critical vulnerabilities that are now converging into a perfect storm. These are what I call the three pillars of fragility: a technically insolvent banking system, an overmanaged and non-convertible currency, and the impossible challenge of maintaining social stability in the face of economic decline. The Chinese Communist Party has built its entire claim to power on its ability to deliver economic growth. As that growth evaporates, its grip on power becomes increasingly tenuous, forcing it into a series of desperate and often contradictory policy choices. The first pillar of fragility is its banking sector, which is sitting on a mountain of bad debt from a collapsed property market. For decades, property was the engine of the Chinese economy, but that engine has now seized. The second pillar is the currency, the renminbi. Beijing must keep the renminbi stable to prevent catastrophic capital flight and maintain the image of economic strength, but doing so requires burning through its foreign reserves and contradicts the need to devalue its currency to boost exports. This creates an impossible trilemma where it cannot save its banks, its currency, and its economy all at the same time. It can choose one, maybe two, but not all three. The third and most crucial pillar is social stability. The unwritten contract between the Communist Party and its 1.4 billion citizens is simple. The people accept the CCP's totalitarian rule in exchange for a constantly improving standard of living. But what happens when that promise is broken? With youth unemployment soaring and the life savings of millions of families tied up in worthless properties, public discontent is simmering. The government must spend vast sums on internal security and surveillance to keep a lid on this unrest, diverting resources that could be used to fix the economy. This creates a vicious cycle. Economic stress fuels social instability, which requires more spending on control, which further strains the economy. These three problems are not separate, they are deeply intertwined, each one making the others worse. A banking crisis would trigger a currency collapse. A currency collapse would wipe out household savings and lead to mass unrest. The fear of mass unrest prevents the government from taking the painful but necessary steps to clean up the banks, like allowing major developers and financial institutions to fail. Beijing is trapped. Its entire economic model was built for a world of rapid growth and endless credit. In this new era of stagnation and deleveraging, that model is breaking apart, and the Communist Party is running out of options to hold it together. The single greatest threat to China's stability is the physics problem lurking within its financial system. For years, the property sector was the heart of the Chinese economy, accounting for a staggering 1/4 to nearly 1/3 of its GDP. It was the primary source of revenue for local governments and critically held over 70% of all household wealth. In 2020, Beijing tried to rein in the sector's reckless borrowing with its three red lines policy, but it was too little, too late. This move pricked the bubble, leading to a cascade of defaults from giants like Evergrande and Country Garden. Property sales plummeted by nearly half, and the entire industry ground to a halt, revealing a black hole of debt. The numbers are difficult to comprehend. Conservative estimates suggest there are between $5 trillion and $10 trillion in hidden property-related losses festering on the balance sheets of Chinese banks and financial institutions. To put that in perspective, the entire declared equity of China's banking system is only about $5 trillion. This means that, by Western accounting standards, the Chinese banking system is technically insolvent. The losses from bad developer loans, debts owed by local government financing vehicles, and mortgages on overvalued properties are larger than the system's entire capital buffer. This isn't just a liquidity problem that can be solved with a simple bailout, it's a solvency crisis of historic proportions. The Communist Party's response has been a strategy of extend and pretend. Acknowledging the true scale of the losses would trigger a full-blown financial panic and require a bailout so massive it would shatter public confidence in the government. Instead, regulators are allowing banks to avoid marking down bad loans, pretending that zombie developers are still viable and that the value of underlying property assets has not collapsed. To manage this slow-motion disaster, China is estimated to be bleeding over $1.1 trillion per year just to conceal these losses and prop up the system. This staggering sum, equivalent to China's entire defense and research and development budgets combined, is being siphoned away from productive investment and innovation. This silent, ongoing bailout is unsustainable. It traps the country in a state of economic paralysis, preventing the creative destruction needed for a healthy economy to recover. While the U.S. government acted decisively during its 2008 financial crisis, forcing banks to recognize losses and recapitalizing the system, China's political system cannot withstand that kind of shock. The Communist Party has painted itself into a corner, choosing to hide the problem rather than solve it. This decision ensures that the banking system will remain a ticking time bomb, draining the nation's resources and leaving it profoundly vulnerable to any external shock, such as the economic decoupling now underway. China's second pillar of fragility is its currency, the renminbi. In a globalized world, a country's currency is its connection to the international financial system, and for China, this connection is both a lifeline and a liability. Beijing faces an impossible choice, often called a trilemma, where it cannot simultaneously maintain a stable exchange rate, allow the free flow of capital, and control its own domestic interest rates. For decades, it has prioritized control, keeping a tight grip on capital flows and the renminbi's value. But as its economic problems mount, this balancing act has become almost impossible to sustain, forcing it to make painful trade-offs that weaken its position against the U.S. On one hand, the Communist Party is desperate to maintain a stable renminbi. A sudden devaluation would trigger a massive wave of capital flight as wealthy Chinese citizens and corporations rush to move their money into safer assets abroad, primarily U.S. dollars. This would look like a vote of no confidence in the government and could precipitate the very bank runs Beijing fears. A stable currency is also central to Xi Jinping's ambition of challenging the U.S. dollar's global dominance. To achieve this, China must project an image of financial strength and reliability. As a result, the People's Bank of China frequently intervenes in currency markets, selling its precious US dollar reserves to buy up renminbi and prop up its value. On the other hand, China's struggling economy desperately needs a weaker currency. With domestic demand collapsing due to the property crisis, Beijing's only remaining strategy for growth is to flood the world with cheap exports of electric vehicles, solar panels, and batteries. A cheaper renminbi would make these goods even more competitive on the global market, helping to offset weakness at home. However, this directly contradicts the goal of a stable currency. Furthermore, this export-led strategy is already failing, as the US, the European Union, and other major economies are erecting tariff walls and launching anti-dumping investigations to protect their own industries from China's subsidized overcapacity. This currency conundrum leaves China trapped. If it devalues the renminbi to boost exports, it risks capital flight and a domestic financial crisis. If it defends the renminbi to ensure stability, its export engine stalls and its economy sinks further into stagnation. This is where the pressure from the US becomes so effective. US tariffs and trade restrictions block China's export escape route, forcing the pain of its economic adjustment inward. Unlike the US, which benefits from the dollar's status as the world's primary reserve currency, China has no such safety net. Its attempts to promote the renminbi internationally have largely failed, with the currency accounting for a mere 3% of global reserves. It is stuck in a financial vice, and every move it makes only tightens the squeeze. The narrative of US-China competition often assumes a relationship of equals, a so-called G2 of superpowers with symmetrical dependencies. But honestly, this is a profound misunderstanding of the true nature of their relationship. The reality is one of deep, structural asymmetry, where China's dependence on the United States and its allies is vast and, well, existential, while America's dependence on China is actually pretty narrow and shrinking. To understand who really has the upper hand in this decoupling, you just need to list what each side absolutely cannot live without. For China, that list is long and touches every critical aspect of its economy. For the US, the list is short and, frankly, manageable. China is fundamentally dependent on the US-led global system for its survival. First and foremost, it needs access to the US dollar system. The vast majority of international trade, including China's own energy and food imports, is priced and settled in dollars. Losing access would, quite frankly, be an economic death sentence. Second, China needs advanced technology, especially high-end semiconductors. Despite investing billions in its Made in China 2025 initiative, China is still stuck at less advanced 7-nanometer chips, while the US and its allies, like Taiwan and the Netherlands, control the cutting edge at 3 nanometers and below. Without these chips, China's ambitions in artificial intelligence, supercomputing, and advanced military hardware are, well, permanently stalled. The list of China's dependencies goes on. Its businesses run on American software ecosystems, with over 90% of enterprises using platforms like Microsoft Windows or Oracle. It needs access to consumer markets. Remember, the US and its allies represent over 55% of global GDP, a market that simply cannot be replaced by the so-called Global South. China is also a major food importer, relying on countries like the US for critical supplies of soybeans and corn to feed its population and livestock. In essence, China needs the world that America built, its financial plumbing, its technological blueprints, its consumer markets, and even its food. It has benefited immensely from this system, but it has never managed to replicate it or create a viable alternative. In stark contrast, America's primary dependency on China is singular and honestly temporary, the processing of rare earth elements and other critical minerals. China currently controls about 85% of this market, which is vital for defense technology and green energy. But this is not an insurmountable problem. It's really just an engineering challenge with a deadline. The US and its allies are aggressively investing in building alternative supply chains. Projects in Texas, Australia, and Louisiana are set to come online between 2026 and 2028, which will significantly reduce this vulnerability. By 2030, China's leverage in this area will be largely neutralized. Beyond that, US dependencies are irreplaceable, low-tech goods like toys and textiles. The exchange is clear. China needs America's entire system, while America just needs to rebuild one specific part of its supply chain. A common misconception is that China's massive holdings of U.S. assets, estimated at around $2.5 trillion, give it powerful leverage over the United States. The theory goes that if tensions escalate, Beijing could dump its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds, causing chaos in financial markets and a spike in American borrowing costs. This has even been called China's financial nuclear option. However, if you look a bit closer, you'll see that this is actually a fundamental misreading of the power dynamics. In reality, these assets are not a weapon for China. They're more like a hostage held by the United States. In any serious conflict, this financial interdependence actually becomes a critical American strength, not a Chinese one. Imagine for a moment that China tries to execute this threat. It begins to sell its roughly $1.1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds on the open market. The initial effect would be a drop in bond prices and a rise in yields. But honestly, this would be a self-inflicted wound. In a fire sale, China would suffer massive capital losses on its own holdings. More importantly, the U.S. Federal Reserve has the demonstrated ability to absorb such a sale with ease. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the Fed printed and injected over $4 trillion into the financial system in just 18 months to stabilize markets. Buying back China's entire treasury portfolio would be a manageable, if significant, operation. The disruption to the U.S. would be temporary. The financial loss to China would be permanent. The real power, though, lies not in selling, but in freezing. The United States possesses an incredibly powerful legal tool called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. This act gives the president the authority to freeze the assets of foreign countries held within the U.S. financial system. And this isn't just a theoretical power, it was used decisively in 2022 to freeze over $300 billion of Russia's central bank reserves following the invasion of Ukraine. In a scenario involving a major crisis, such as a Chinese move on Taiwan, the U.S. could, and almost certainly would, use IEEPA to instantly freeze all of China's $2.5 trillion in liquid assets, its treasuries, its stocks, and its corporate bonds. This creates a starkly asymmetric situation. With the stroke of a pen, the U.S. could neutralize trillions of dollars of China's wealth. So, what could China do in retaliation? Its only move would be to nationalize the physical illiquid assets of American companies operating on its soil, which are estimated to be worth between $500 billion and $1 trillion. Not only is this a fraction of what China stands to lose, but seizing physical factories and storefronts is a messy, complicated process that would trigger an immediate and total collapse in foreign investment and send its own currency into a freefall. The financial hostage is tied up in a way that overwhelmingly favors the hostage taker, the United States. In the strategic competition between the U.S. and China, the style of engagement matters just as much as the substance. China's totalitarian top-down system is built on a foundation of central planning. Its leaders create detailed 5-year plans that dictate economic targets, technological goals, and resource allocation. This system thrives on stability and predictability. It needs to know the rules of the game years in advance to optimize its strategy. And, this is precisely why a more unpredictable and, at times, seemingly chaotic American foreign policy is an incredibly effective tool for a stronger power to use against a weaker, more rigid one. This chaos strategy is actually rooted in game theory. When a stronger player faces a weaker one, adopting a mixed strategy of unpredictable actions can be mathematically optimal. By randomly alternating between threats of high tariffs, offers of negotiation, and sudden policy shifts, the U.S. forces China into a state of planning paralysis. The Chinese system must expend enormous resources preparing for every possible contingency. Should they stockpile semiconductors in case of a new ban? Should they reroute supply chains in case of tariffs on a new sector? Should they dump dollars or hold them? The constant uncertainty exhausts their decision-making capacity and makes long-term planning basically impossible. The Trump administration's approach from 2018 to 2020, while often criticized for its lack of coherence, was a textbook example of this strategy in action. Random tariff threats via Twitter, shifting demands in trade talks, and unpredictable geopolitical moves kept Beijing constantly off balance. In contrast, a more traditional, predictable approach, like the one often favored by the Biden administration, which announces policy changes far in advance and builds consensus with allies, inadvertently gives China the one thing it needs most: time. When the US signals its intentions clearly, it allows China to preemptively stockpile goods, build workarounds, and coordinate its defenses, blunting the impact of American policy. This dynamic reveals a core structural advantage for the United States. The American system, decentralized, capitalist, and inherently more chaotic, is anti-fragile. It can absorb shocks and adapt to volatility far better than China's brittle, centralized state. U.S. companies and markets are accustomed to uncertainty and react quickly to changing conditions. China's state-owned enterprises and centrally directed economy are not. By introducing chaos into the system, the U.S. leverages its own innate resilience while exploiting China's greatest weakness. This strategic unpredictability isn't a sign of confusion. It's actually a sophisticated weapon in the economic war, designed to make China's vaunted planning model its own worst enemy. While the US-China decoupling is a long-term process, there is a specific period in the near future that really stands out as a window of maximum danger. The years between 2027 and 2030 represent a critical convergence point, where several powerful trends will intersect, potentially forcing a crisis. This is the period when China's relative power may be at its peak before a long, irreversible decline sets in. For Beijing's leadership, this creates a use it or lose it dynamic, especially when it comes to its long-held ambition to annex Taiwan. 4 key countdowns are set to collide in this danger zone, making it the most perilous moment in the 21st century geopolitical landscape. The first countdown is demographic. China's working-age population peaked in 2015 and is now shrinking dramatically. Between 2025 and 2030 alone, it's projected to lose another 40 million workers. By 2030, over 300 million people, or more than 20% of its population, will be over the age of 60, placing an unbearable strain on a woefully inadequate pension and healthcare system. This demographic cliff means China is growing old before it has grown rich, and its window to project power based on a massive labor force is closing fast. The economic and social burden of this aging population will severely constrain its military and technological ambitions in the coming decades. The second countdown is America's diminishing vulnerability. As we've discussed, China's most powerful economic weapon is its control over rare earth mineral processing. However, massive investments by the US and its allies are set to create alternative supply chains. By 2028, the West is projected to achieve 30 to 40% independence, enough to secure its critical defense needs. After 2030, a Chinese export embargo on these materials would shift from being a crippling blow to a mere annoyance. This means China's most potent non-military leverage has an expiration date, and that date falls squarely within this critical window. The third and fourth countdowns are political. Xi Jinping, born in 1953, will be in his mid-70s during this period. The 21st Party Congress in 2027 and the 22nd in 2032 are seen as key milestones. The 2027 to 2032 window may represent his last best chance to secure his historical legacy by reunifying with Taiwan before China's decline becomes undeniable. This timeline is further pressured by Taiwan's own election cycles. With the pro-sovereignty Democratic Progressive Party solidifying its power, Beijing may conclude that the peaceful path to unification is permanently closed, creating a now-or-never mentality. This convergence of demographic decline, waning economic leverage, and political timelines makes 2027 to 2030 the point of no return. If the economic decoupling between the US and China were to accelerate into a full-blown separation, maybe triggered by a crisis over Taiwan, the outcomes for the two nations would be starkly different. The impact on the United States would be serious but ultimately manageable, and, in the long run, actually beneficial. The impact on China, however, would be nothing short of catastrophic, leading to an economic depression, widespread social unrest, and an existential threat to the rule of the Communist Party. This dramatic asymmetry in outcomes is the final and most compelling reason why the strategic showdown overwhelmingly favors the United States. For the US, an immediate break would trigger a significant supply chain shock. Consumers would face empty shelves and a sharp spike in inflation, likely in the range of 6 to 10%. The economy would almost certainly enter a recession, with GDP contracting by an estimated 2 to 5%. These are painful consequences, no doubt. However, they are survivable. The crisis would unleash a powerful wave of investment in reshoring and reindustrialization, as manufacturing and critical supply chains are rebuilt on American soil or in allied nations. After the initial shock, the U.S. would emerge with a more resilient, secure, and ultimately stronger domestic economy, having finally weaned itself off its dependence on a strategic adversary. For China, the consequences would be dire. A sudden cutoff from global markets and the U.S. dollar system would be an immediate knockout blow. The renminbi would collapse, likely losing 30 to 50% of its value overnight, triggering hyperinflation and wiping out savings. Bank runs would become widespread as the government's extend and pretend strategy is exposed. The freezing of its $2.5 trillion in overseas assets would evaporate its financial cushion. With its export markets gone, factories would close en masse, leading to an economic depression with a GDP contraction of 10 to 15% and unemployment soaring past 25%. This level of economic devastation would almost certainly lead to severe social unrest, challenging the CCP's very survival. In the end, the story of the US-China decoupling is one of structural strength versus structural fragility. The United States is a flexible, innovative nation with the world's reserve currency, powerful allies, and a resilient economic system. Its key dependency is temporary and solvable. China is a rigid, debt-ridden state facing a demographic collapse, a banking crisis, and a crisis of political legitimacy. Its dependencies on the US-led global order are total and permanent, while many investors and policymakers are still positioned for a managed, gradual separation. The reality is that the breakup is accelerating, hostile, and deeply asymmetric. Time is on America's side, and in this strategic showdown, the final outcome is not in doubt.